before we adjourn for dinner is I'm going to invite Chris Temple to come up and do a talk about what's going on currently in Ecuador and the different opportunities that exist down there. And I'd like to hear what Chris has to say. So here's Chris Temple from the National Investor Newsletter. Thanks, Chris.
I guess you call this a relief pitcher or the backup or plan B or whatever you want to call it, but I'm going to give you a quick Cliff Notes version of the hottest country story in the world right now in the mining sector, and it's one that virtually every active investor still is asleep on, and that's the country of Ecuador. How many of you know where about 46% of the globe's total copper supply comes from? Where does that copper supply come from? Chile. The Andes Mountains in South America. There is a gaping hole that's very conspicuous in the Andes Mountains where there has been no, to date, significant copper development. Guess which country that is? Ecuador. But things are getting cranked up down there, and in recent months, bit by bit, the industry has been waking up. You now have major mining companies the world over who are literally fighting over getting concessions in a country that many investors still think, and many investment analysts and even newsletter writers will still tell you is closed to business and you don't want anything to do with Ecuador. So I'm going to disabuse you of that notion, because a few years ago, when a couple of us started to understand the next big mine in the world was in the process of being discovered. It's called the Cascabel deposit in northwestern Ecuador, which you're likely to see in the next few months to introduce a maiden resource estimate on a tiny fraction of that concession that will be 1 billion tons of 1% or greater copper equivalent. This is the hottest thing in the world right now. This is why you've seen Cornerstone Capital Resources stock go up 15 times in price in the last year and a half. They were at the show a few years ago, some of you remember. SolGold, their senior partner and operator of Cascabel, has gone up similarly in that time. And they are the biggest story right now in Ecuador, but they're far from the only story. I'm going to give you a couple of teasers in just a minute. But why do you think, somebody tell me why, if you have some background information on this, people would say that Ecuador is not a good place to do business. Why do you think that is? Any ideas?
Confiscated companies,
That's what a lot of people believe, they confiscated companies. Untrue, but that's what some of the rumors were.
A windfall profits tax. A windfall profit tax.
The windfall profits tax was part of what was being proposed a couple of years ago. It was actually fairly fair and fairly transparent. The Minister of Mines, Javier Cordova, about a year and a half ago, I'm sitting in his office, and he spent half an hour explaining to me how the windfall profits tax will probably never be triggered unless in short order you had a quantum jump in the gold price. They have now done away with the windfall profits tax down there. Not that it mattered anyway. Let me tell you why, to save time, Ecuador for a while had a black mark over it. Some of you remember the discovery by a company called Aurelian Resources back in the middle 2000s of what's the Fruta del Norte deposit. It's in the southeastern part of the country, very rich gold and silver project, and it caused a mad staking rush in Ecuador. Everybody and their brother and their dog and their geologist and their CFO and their lawyer and their accountant were all in a mad dash to get to Ecuador and grab whatever could be grabbed. At the time, there was a lot of funny business that went on. You had a lot of people that were overbidding one another. If you greased the right person's palm, you got a concession, even though this guy over here rightfully should have had it. And a lot of that kind of stuff went on. In 2007, Rafael Correa, who was one of the better presidents of any South American country in any of our lifetimes, was elected. And the first thing he did was he stopped all of that. He put a moratorium on any new granting of concessions. He suspended the rights that every company had to concessions that had been granted previously until it all got sorted out. Now, As I say in part on a flyer that's out there that will also direct you to my website where I have much, much more information on Ecuador and some of the companies. What I just told you is where most people's recollections stopped. And even some so-called analysts, that is where the recollection of Ecuador stopped. But what happened within just a couple of years after the moratorium is that they started to sort out what was legitimate, what was legitimately bid for, where was there not graft and bribery involved, where were there companies bidding on concessions that actually were spending money on these greenfield projects. And in every single case, whatever was legitimate was quickly restored to the companies involved. One of them being, I mentioned the name Cornerstone Capital Resources, which after about 2011 got the concession freed back up to the Cascabel deposit in the northwestern part of that country. And I won't go into the whole story for time's sake, because you've already been sitting long enough and you've all heard the old saying, right? The mind can only absorb what the seat can endure. So I'm not going to make your seats endure too much of me right now. You'll get me and the rest of the crew later on. But in 6 years, approximately, from the time Cornerstone got that back, the next year brought in an Australian company, Sol Gold, as an earn-in partner, and they earned in spades, and they now have got, again, the hottest thing in the world as far as a new copper gold porphyry discovery. I defy you to find anything in the US or even in Canada that has gone from what was still a greenfield exploration project 6 years ago to now having the daylights drilled out of it, and they're adding 3 more drill rigs between now and the first of the year, to the point where they're going to issue a maiden resource estimate that's going to be obscene. I mean, this thing, if any of you, and I've got a few subscribers here, several times there have been intercepts of more than 1 kilometer of 1% or greater copper equivalent. Several of them of several hundred meters of 3% copper equivalent. This thing is just, it's a monster. It's got everybody scratching their head trying to figure out, wow, how many more of these things might there be in Ecuador? It's just amazing. So you've got a situation where, and I'll go back to early 2016, you know, Cornerstone's share price was down to 2 cents a share Canadian. Sol Gold was selling for 2 or 3 pence on London's AIM market. And even though there were starting to be some initial drill intercepts that were starting to get a few people's eyebrows going up, nobody really cared. Well, last summer, the end of this summer, in fact it was 13 months ago, it was a year ago last month, I was in Quito, and they had kind of what I've characterized the official coming out party of this reinvigorated Ecuadorian mining sector. And the guy who was the head at the time, the president of the country's Chamber of Mines, just like the private Chamber of Commerce for the whole mining industry for the country, I was in his office 3 or 4 days before the actual event that they had at the beautiful new Marriott Hotel in Quito. If you've never been to Quito, Ecuador, treat yourself. World Heritage Site as far as cities, the highest elevation capital city in the world, the most beautiful capital city I have ever been in any place. The whole country is just, and I could go on all night about it. But they ended up, you know, I asked him how many people he thought he had coming. He was about 125, 130. They had about 220 people. There were analysts, engineers, mining executives, you name it, from all over the world. Perhaps not by coincidence, at the same time this meeting was taking place, a bidding war, a miniature bidding war started for Sol Gold, where you had Newcrest Mining, a big Australian producer. They were putting money into the company. A couple of hedge funds were putting money into Sol Gold. And then almost out of nowhere, BHP Billiton came out and wanted to try and essentially, I won't get into all the details, but essentially try and take over the whole project when it was in its infancy. And they essentially got laughed away because, just as is the case with Cornerstone, Sol Gold is tightly held enough by management and insiders and people who are in it for the long run that they weren't going to let BHP take it on the cheap. There will be more serious efforts later to take this thing out, especially when they start piling up and then adding to resource estimates. But that really started to get people's eyebrows going up. And when people understood as well that in Ecuador you have now a very transparent tax and regulatory regimen, the government hired Wood Mackenzie. Some of you have heard that name before, very well known in the industry, global powerhouse when it comes to engineering and accounting and a whole variety of things that they do. They actually hired Wood Mackenzie to come down and say, look, we need help. We're smart enough to know that we don't know what we're doing. So please come down here and show us how investors in Canada and in the US and Australia and elsewhere will one day be able to look at Ecuador and say, okay, I get this, it's fair, I understand it, and so forth. And they've done that. Furthermore, when at the same time, and I mentioned BHP, does anybody know the story about the Escondida copper mine and the amount of money that BHP is having to spend to get more fresh water there because they don't have any more? $3 billion for a couple new desalination plants on the Pacific coast and to pipe that water to the largest copper mine in the world to keep it going. Exactly the opposite situation you have in Ecuador, where in a couple of more years, thanks to President Correa, who left office in the spring, you're going to have 90% of Ecuador's power supplied by hydropower in that country. They've got power and water coming out of their ears. And the costs for companies that develop mines in Ecuador in years to come is going to be between 1/3 and 1/2 of the average about every place else in South America. So it's now a transparent jurisdiction to operate in. It's an inexpensive jurisdiction to operate in, and really anchored by Cascabel and that discovery. And the industry understands this now. What's astonishing to me even today is that very, very few people in the analyst community and very, very few investors get this. A lot of early money has been made on the companies involved in Cascabel, but there's a couple other ones that I cover in Ecuador. I mentioned Fruta del Norte. Does anybody know the name of the man who discovered Fruta del Norte? Anybody know?
Keith Barron.
Keith Barron. That's what everybody believes, but that answer is technically wrong. Because there's a geologist who is the most traveled geologist in that country that led Keith Barron by the hand to discover Fruta del Norte. He has his own company that just entered an agreement with a company tied to Altius Minerals, one of the wealthiest royalty companies for base metals in the world, lots of cash, and this man's company is going to be the next cornerstone in Ecuador. They're checking all the boxes in the same progression that Cornerstone did. And this company today has the richest deposit in that whole country. Imagine, if you will, a 43101 resource estimate any place outside of Ecuador that has 5% copper and 5% zinc and half an ounce of gold and 6 ounces of silver per ton. Now, if that was in Canada or Australia, people would be fighting over this thing. Because it's in Ecuador and most people are still asleep, the stock can't get the time of day. So this is going to be the next, I believe, home run in that country. And there's other stories down there too. But anyway, grab that flyer if you didn't get it already that's out there. It'll direct you to a lot more stuff, more companies, a lot more information on Ecuador itself. And again, it is the big country story and the big emerging mining story in the world right now. And you're going to do yourself a big favor if you don't wait any longer before you really get your head around it. So if you have any questions, let me know later on. I'll be flitting around here. We'll be at dinner, and then the rest of us clowns, me and the other couple, and Dr. Warren. Dr. Warren's not a clown, the rest of us are clowns. We'll all have a lot of fun after dinner. Since Eric's gone, you're dismissed. I'll take that, and I'll do what you need to do before we get ready for dinner, which I think is 6 o'clock on the schedule, right, folks?
Yes.
I don't know what time it is. Oh, you got a half hour. You got time to stretch and all that.